Good morning. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special trip report from the participants of a Washington Institute study tour throughout the Middle East. We just returned a couple of days ago from a whirlwind visit that took the seven of us to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority. It was a compressed, highly focused trip in which we had the opportunity to meet with senior political, military, intelligence, diplomatic officials everywhere we traveled, and take some very important site visits, as I'll note as we get further into our program. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce the members of our delegation. I'm going to offer some opening remarks about our trip, and then I'm going to turn to two respected former legislators who traveled with professionals from the Washington Institute. First, I'm going to turn to former Senator Cory Gardner from the great state of Colorado. Former Senator Gardner served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Delighted to have him on our trip and to have him live with us from Colorado for today's event. And with former Congressman Howard Berman of California. Howard, who's a member of the Washington Institute's Board of Advisors, served for decades in the House of Representatives, including as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm delighted to have Howard from his home in California. Also joining me on our panel today, on my immediate left, is Dana Stroul. Dana served until recently as the top civilian official in the Pentagon for the Middle East. She has rejoined the Washington Institute as our Casson Family Fellow and our research director. Delighted to have Dana back with us in our leadership team. To Dana's left is Raith El-Omari. Raith is a senior fellow at the Institute. He is a former negotiator for the Palestinian Authority in negotiations and the peace process negotiations with the Israelis back in the headier days of the peace process. Raith, I should have noted, is our Gilbert fellow here at the Institute. And at the far end of the table, I'm delighted to have Mike Singh. Mike is the managing director of the Institute and the Lane Swig senior fellow here. Mike has service both as a foreign service officer abroad and as a senior director in the National Security Council in the George W. Bush administration. So we had a bipartisan team of former legislators, a bipartisan team of policy practitioners, and we were assisted throughout our travels by Fran McDonough. Fran is the senior research assistant of the Institute, and she helped make sure that everything moved as smoothly as it did. So I'm going to offer some remarks, turn to Senator Gardner and Congressman Berman, and then open up to questions from my colleagues, because this is a rare time in American Middle East policy when so many different issues are on the plate of the president and our senior leadership and are being reviewed with the possibility of enormous change in American approach to some of these issues in the weeks ahead. Again, before I begin, most people who have joined these programs know the procedure. If you have questions for our panelists as we proceed, please feel free to send them in via the Q&A function of your Zoom bar if you're joining us on Zoom. If you're on some other platform, please send them directly to my email, which is rsatloff, RSATLOFF, @washingtoninstitute.org. So I've traveled to the Levant, Israel, and its neighbors many times over the last 40 years, often during moments of conflict, such as the Lebanon War and the First and Second Intifada. This trip was different. Dark clouds that accompanied us were not just the rain that we saw everywhere from Riyadh to Tel Aviv. There was a sadness, a sobriety, a harshness that was everywhere. especially in Israel, but not solely there. Our group spent a half day in Kfar Aza, one of the communities that suffered the most from the October 7th attack, walking around with a survivor telling his family's story of being locked in a safe room for 21 hours with two little children as Hamas terrorists were going house to house, machine gunning kids in their bed and leaving hand grenades in refrigerators so that survivors and first responders would themselves get blown up even after the attack. And then just over the empty field that Hamas attackers traversed in the blink of an eye to mount their attack, one can also see and hear the bombs going off in Beit Hanun. It was the war, past and present, in one frame. Now, in relative terms, the nearly 30,000 killed so far in this conflict is a small percentage compared to the staggering fatality counts of Assad's brutality, the generation of war in Afghanistan, the genocides in Darfur, Rwanda, or Cambodia. But the shock and horror is real. One cannot but be moved by the enormity and the depth of the human tragedy among Israelis and Palestinians. In our visits to Arab states, in private, I think it's fair to say they were all rooting for Israel to destroy Hamas. One senior official even said, quote, "Israel is fighting for us in Gaza, and if they win, they will succeed in defeating an Iranian proxy for the first time in 40 years. But in practice, Arab states are focused on their own security and their own interests, and are either unwilling or unable to play much of a role in shaping the outcome in Gaza or in helping to fill the vacuum that will be left by the Hamas defeat that they all privately say they want. By and large, they all want to go back to October 6th, except on one point. They all face domestic political urgency thanks to the wildly one-sided picture painted by Al Jazeera and other media, to which they have channeled newfound energy to produce some tangible progress on the goal of Palestinian statehood. It's not readily apparent that this emerges from the people of Gaza, who surely have other things on their mind. It is a requirement of post-war diplomacy that only through chance circumstances is connected to the war. And that is because there was progress on the Big Bang Saudi-Israeli-U.S. trilateral deal as of October 6th that Riyadh would love to get over the finish line, but they don't really want to do too much to get it there. What we heard is that it's up to America to convince Israel that it's reasonable that the price it should be willing to pay Saudi Arabia is higher today, given the events 6th, October 7th. There's almost zero appreciation that Israel today is a very different country, that even talking about a two-state solution is viewed by many Israelis as bizarre, even perverse. I have to admit that I understand Saudi motivation for a defense treaty less today than before our trip. That's because so many Saudis tout the benefits they've received from the détente that they worked out with Iran nearly a year ago. A détente, they say, that has spared the kingdom from Iranian mischief that has spread virtually everywhere else. And if, as many suggest, at least one rationale for October 7th was to upset the prospect of Saudi-Israel normalization, logic would dictate that the Iranians have other things up their sleeves to spoil a renewed push toward that normalization now. So while I applaud the Saudis for saying they want a closer, more intimate relationship with the United States, I have to admit that I remain confounded by their eagerness for the unknown of a U.S. defense treaty, a treaty that will only have the U.S. promise to consult in times of emergency, jettisoning the relative quiet they've enjoyed for the past year. Maybe that's just me. The fact is they want it, and Israel wants the normalization. For different reasons, for different people, of course, but fundamentally because it's a way out of isolation that the Israelis currently face, and because it gives Israel a broad strategic regional alliance in its confrontation with Iran. Are they willing to pay the price for it? Do we even know the real price? Do Saudis and Israelis discuss this together, which is the logical order of things? Unknown. Talking about this with most Israelis is an experience in cognitive dissonance. They see the world solely through the lens of October 7. The humanitarian impact of the war is not on the popular radar and is generally viewed, even at high levels of government, as a secondary aspect of the war fighting against Hamas. To their credit, with only one exception, we did not hear Israeli officials talk in ideologically maximalist terms about their war aims. By and large, they were quite precise. Dismantle Hamas military capacity and Hamas's governing capability, so Hamas cannot again mount a military threat to Israel or stand in the way of alternative governance in Gaza. But operationally, there was not a single Israeli we met who questioned the wisdom of the Rafah operation, merely the timing and the details of the plan to move civilians, about which they are confident, though real details of their plan are scanty. And given that there's 1 million+ people involved, that's a big question mark. In private conversation, Arab officials, especially but not solely military and intelligence officials, express great sympathy and understanding for Israel's situation. Despite the political environment, these Arab states are still working closely with Israel to stem Iranian smuggling and to coordinate against radical plans to escalate on other fronts. But the political coordination on the future of Gaza is very weak. With one or two narrow exceptions, it's almost non-existent. Arabs want America to carry water here too. They aren't even willing to do the hard work on something like Palestinian reform, which everyone says is essential, but few are willing to make happen. It bears remembering that the most significant reform was forced upon the Palestinian Authority by a Republican president 20 years ago, George W. Bush, who we'll talk about this a bit later in our program, who insisted on a performance-based roadmap, one that is a far cry from the loose talk about a time-bound, irreversible step toward a Palestinian state we hear in return for the current PA leader to do little more than exchange one crony prime minister for another. And on top of that, we heard even more objectionable talk about throwing Hamas a lifeline by bringing it under the PLO umbrella now. In the current environment, about as terrible an idea as I could imagine. If Washington, Cairo, Riyadh, Amman, or other capitals expect Israelis to emerge from their post-October 7th fog anytime soon, I think they'll be sorely disappointed. In the best of circumstances, Hamas and Israel will soon reach an agreement for an extended pause in fighting, what is now being termed, quote, temporary ceasefire, in which many of the remaining hostages will be released. This is not a done deal yet, but I'm told they're close to a zone of agreement. Even so, my instinct is that not all the hostages will be released, because I'm skeptical that Sinwar and his colleagues will fulfill the terms of this deal any more than they didn't fulfill the terms of the last deal. Now, many hostages, especially the women, will come out with horror stories that almost surely will further enrage Israelis and propel them to wait out the end of the pause to resume fighting, especially if the hostages that remain are only soldiers, not civilians. All those other capitals have something else in mind, not only to use the pause as an off-ramp from the war altogether, but in that time to pull opportunity out of crisis, to extract just enough from Israel on a practical, if extended vision of Palestinian self-determination and a recognized state to allow for Saudi-Israel normalization, a U.S.-Saudi mutual defense treaty, perhaps a U.S.-Saudi civilian nuclear agreement, and perhaps even an Israeli-Lebanon, which is really an Israel-Hezbollah understanding that would bring those parties back from the brink of war. And all that, including Senate ratification, is supposed to happen in just a matter of weeks, perhaps a few months. In other words, Joe Biden will soon decide whether he, like every president since Jimmy Carter, will risk his presidency on the pursuit of Middle East peace. But in this case, he has in mind a miraculous bank shot that by summer could end the Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli conflicts once and for all. God bless him, but put me down as a skeptic. I give the Biden administration enormous credit for taking swift and decisive measures to deter escalation in this conflict. But let's not kid ourselves. A certain escalation did happen. Israelis say they're fighting 7 hot fronts of military operation: Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran. They're directly involved in 6, leaving outsiders to address the Houthis. But even with Iran husbanding its resources and avoiding a direct confrontation, it has activated all those fronts, and it watches safely from the confines of its own territory as its adversaries take on one proxy after another. We may be scoring tactical victories in this, but it's not even clear that we're fighting the right game. And I haven't even mentioned the Iranian nuclear program, a topic that barely came up in our travels, probably just the way Iran wants it. To end on a hopeful note, I do think the Israelis are coming to the end of main battle operations. Rafah may be a question mark, but there aren't any Rafahs after Rafah. Hopefully, we can soon turn to the question of what fills the vacuum in Gaza. Contractors around the region, and we met with some, are eager to rebuild. Some Arab countries have signaled a willingness to eventually do things on the ground in Gaza, in certain instances, far more ambitiously than ever contemplated before. We heard that the Emiratis are especially in this group, but we didn't visit Abu Dhabi on this trip. The Israelis are slow on this front, both because they are focused on the military issues and because of the politics involved. And here, I don't just mean the far right's messianic aspirations to resettle Gush Katif, but the more general Israeli political sense that it is wrong to make North Gaza safe enough for Palestinians to return home until the Israeli evacuees are themselves safe enough to return to their burnt and ransacked homes in southern Israel. But the Israelis are beginning with baby steps. As the Times of Israel reported this week, they just launched a pilot project that has local Gazans unaffiliated with either Hamas or the Palestinian Authority running a neighborhood in Gaza City. I have my doubts that it is replicable on a broad scale, given that international aid agencies and foreign countries that will be necessary for reconstruction will want some connection to the Palestinian Authority, but at least it shows a start. Because real victory will not come just with the dismantling of Hamas, but with its replacement with something much, much better. And on that task, there's a lot of hard work yet to do. With that, I'll turn to Senator Cory Gardner.
Yeah, thank you, Rob, and thanks to the Washington Institute for the opportunity to talk on this event today and the opportunity to dive deep into the challenges and the potential promises of domestic politics for Middle East peacemaking. When I joined the United States Senate in 2015, I sought out the chairmanship of the Asia Subcommittee on Foreign Relations Committee because I felt that Congress had not made the Asia Pacific a priority in our diplomacy and national security efforts. Well, 9 years later, 2024, we now need to ask ourselves the question that powers in the Middle East are asking. Did the Asia rebalance go too far? And is the current Middle East crisis the stopping point for the U.S. on its complete pivot to Asia? If the answer is yes, as some in Congress would like it to be, there will be more conflict, more generations lost to war, and one more blow to the U.S., whose interest will remain forever in the shadow of Iran and its proxies' terror. There's no magical thinking, as we heard over and over, that can solve this crisis. There's much hard work ahead. Those outside of Israel are demanding a ceasefire now, as we heard over and over. But in Israel, the fight will continue its drive toward the end of Hamas, and the Palestinians intimidated by Hamas, even if they break from them and move toward peace. Throughout our visit and across the region, we heard one American's name cited as often as Joe Biden. And no, it's probably not who you're thinking about. That person was Lindsey Graham. We repeatedly heard the reference to his, what has now become famous in the region, pieces of advice to the leaders of Saudi Arabia, that they should seek a deal now with Biden as president. Otherwise, there would be no way to get the 67 votes in the Senate needed to approve a mutual defense treaty. This is an important point and certainly accurate in the need for 67 as far as it goes, but there's a lot more to it, a lot more behind that that needs to be taken into account than this basic timing and numerical advice. First, we need to remember that a mutual defense treaty is, by its nature, mutual. This seems to be getting lost, or at least short-shrifted, in the conversations. So far, there is very little talk about what the U.S. gets from this idea. In fact, it seems that there's not been much attention or contemplation of what this would look like at all. I assure you, the United States Senate is not going to easily promise that America will come to the defense of Saudi Arabia without knowing what the Saudis are promising to contribute to our security. If the Saudis believe their willingness to normalize with Israel is the sum total of what they are bringing to the table, without some flesh on the bones of the Saudi commitment to align themselves strategically with the United States, I believe the U.S. Senate will view that as completely insufficient. I understand this means difficult positioning for Saudi Arabia and the discomfort of addressing an unforeseen future, but I cannot see a Senate willing to give an armor-plated defense deal in return for something far less hardened. Second is the Trump factor. We just witnessed over the last several weeks how Donald Trump upended the foreign aid bill. As we move toward the summer, his directive hold on the Republican Party and the votes of Republican senators is likely to tighten and strengthen. How will he view a prospective U.S.-Saudi-Israel deal that includes a U.S. defense commitment to Saudi Arabia? Will he oppose it on the grounds of America First? Will he warn Republican senators against voting for a treaty by saying that he could get a better deal, so just wait a little bit longer? And if Donald Trump does become president and no deal has been consummated yet, is there anything Senate Democrats would agree to that bears the Trump signature? This is all a very real possibility and very real scenarios that we have to acknowledge and work through. But in other words, I think we have to recognize that Lindsey Graham was right. If Saudi Arabia wants a mutual defense treaty with the United States, it likely only happen in a Democratic administration. That is necessary, but probably not sufficient. There is a lot more that key actors like the Saudis will need to do to convince senators that such an agreement deserves their votes. And even then, there is a huge political wildcard out there that will have an impact on passage, regardless of what the Saudis or even the Israelis say or do. But there's one thing that's clear to me throughout our visit, that U.S. leadership is paramount. Our enemies, and it was said in our trip, are building a diplomatic ring of fire around the United States' national security interests. If we fail, if American leadership fails, generations will pay the price. Rob, thank you for this time today, and I look forward to the questions and the conversation.
Thank you very much, Senator Gardner. Much appreciated. We'll turn now to Congressman Berman. The floor is yours, Howard. On mute.
Hello. Rob, let me initially say how much I appreciated your invitation for Senator Gardner and I to join you on this trip. I've I have to say initially one comment about the Washington Institute. I've participated in so many of its different programs since its founding in 1985, soon after I came to Congress. And but watching the Washington Institute leadership work on this trip was just remarkable. It Rob's ability, the Institute's ability to get meetings with high officials in Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, intelligence officials, defense officials at very high levels who gave us more time than one might have ever imagined and were more frank in certain ways than I've ever seen any of these folks before. I don't think anyone other than I'm not sure anyone other than the Institute could have, on such a massive basis, put together so many meetings. It gave us a pretty good sense of how they feel and what they won't do in the context of the future. I'm someone who, I'd say from the start of the Oslo talks, has been deeply committed to seeing and pushing for and hoping for a two-state solution to the conflict that has gone on. I have watched 4 Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ephraim Snee, and Ehud Olmert, all 4 of them push hard to get that kind of an agreement. I've watched first Yasser Arafat and more recently Abu Mazen, never willing to come to that final situation agreement. And of course, one prime minister who generally has not shared my feelings or the feelings of other prime ministers in Israel, the current Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, he himself in 2009, with a speech at Bar Ilan and then opening up the possibility of negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, was rejected for till near the very end of that time period, and nothing came of it. So it's in the context of all of this that we particularly our trip to Israel made clear that the question now of the agenda for negotiating a two-state solution is out of the range of sight of the Israeli people in a general sense, left, right, and center. This is not an ideological thing for most of these people. Many of these people have been opposed to, and the current prime minister, who and I will, at least from my point of view, have to point out that made a serious mistake in his effort to avoid dealing with the Palestinian Authority of building certain kinds of relationships with Hamas, urging Qatar to provide financial assistance, opening up work slots in Israel for people from Gaza. Certainly backfired in the context of things. But at this particular point, whatever one thinks about views about Palestinian state, the issue for Israel now, from left to right, is achieving the goals of the current fight, and I add to that the scars that come from this fight. Rob mentioned our incredible trip to a kibbutz that had been invaded by the Hamas folks. One almost has to take that trip to fully understand and see the carnage that was done and why these groups of people, many of whom were the most peace-seeking people in all of Israel, became victims, and the destruction and just the ugliness of what had been done. From my mind, there's no way of thinking that even if to the extent the war ends, there will not be an Israeli interest in ensuring by holding on, at least for the near future, to the territories immediately adjacent to these kibbutzes in Gaza, to ensure that this kind of a thing does not happen again. Our trips in Israel, our trip to Israel, I think, gave me a sense of just how broad the feeling is against going back to the norms of potential negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. They're in a battle. They want to achieve its goal. I don't think it's to find every Hamas member in Gaza and kill him or push him out of Gaza, but I think they want to ensure that they can topple the top leadership of Hamas, both from its military role and its governance role, and the issues that are ahead vis-a-vis Iran, who I think I can't avoid the notion of thinking that Iran had a bigger role than it likes to say it had in this decision, because of their reaction to what seemed to be a strong push, particularly by the Saudis, for a working out a deal with Israel. And as Rob said, mostly in the context of what they hoped they could get from the United States. And my final comment will be that we see it every day in one way or another. Most recently in the U.S. veto of the most recent resolution that it was the only member of the Security Council to oppose, that this administration, the Biden administration, is quite committed to assisting Israel in this effort. My guess is that there are people in Israel who would like Biden to provide the support and just bow out of the process. But I think Israel is better off having Biden do what he's doing than the alternative would be. And with that, take it over, Rob.
Very good. Thank you very much, Howard. And thank you, Cory. I'm now going to turn to my fellow panelists up here. Before then, let me just remind all of our viewers, if you have questions for any of us, please feel free to send them to the Q&A function of your Zoom bar or email me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. Let me ask questions that I have for each of my colleagues. So Dana, can you give us a sense of the U.S. strategy that has emerged since October 7th on the various layers of threat and challenge that we've seen around the Middle East?
Thanks, Rob, for that question, and hello to all of you tuning in. To start, immediately after the October 7th attack, the administration articulated the ways in which it was going to support Israel in its efforts to restore security to its country and its people, and also to ensure that Hamas could never again be able to perpetrate an attack like it did on October 7th. So, first of all, that was making available additional defense articles, increasing U.S. defense posture across the Middle East, offering advice on ways to prioritize hostage recovery during the Israel Defense Forces operations in Gaza, and standing up for Israel and its right to defend itself on the international stage. This has broadly been the lines of effort that the administration has used to support Israel. And what I want to make clear here is that U.S. forces are not involved on the ground in the Israel Defense Forces campaign to dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza. Since October 7th, in addition to the support that the United States has provided to Israel for its campaign in Gaza, there are two other concurrent and occurring crises at the same time. The first is Iran activating its proxies across the region to both challenge Israel and seek to impose costs on the United States for its support for Israel and its operations in Gaza. So for the United States, that's been Iran-backed proxies and militias attacking more than 180 times U.S. forces who are in Iraq and Syria. They're on the ground for a defeat ISIS campaign, but on the receiving end of Iran-funded, armed, and trained proxy groups that are attacking U.S. forces. And then we also heard from Israeli officials during our travels that they have also experienced attacks from these same Iran-backed groups from Syria and Iraq launched toward Israel. The U.S. approach here has not been to meet every attack against U.S. forces with an attack against these groups, but to selectively seek to impose costs on Iran and its Quds Force proxies across the region. So since October 17th, the President Biden has approved strikes against facilities affiliated with Iran and Syria, then facilities associated with Iran in Iraq, then Iraqi militia leaders supported by Iran in Iraq, and there are additional options. And as Rob noted, at this point, the Iranian strategy of supporting proxies and a U.S.-backed response that is seeking to strike on these proxies but not on Iran itself has at this point prevented the region from tipping into full-scale war. But at the same time, Iran does not appear to be deterred from continuing to support and arm those proxies, and it remains to be seen what those attacks look like going forward. And the third crisis is in the Red Sea, where again, an Iran-backed group, the Houthis, have launched increasingly sophisticated attacks against any manner of commercial or military ships seeking to transit the southern Red Sea. And here the Houthis have positioned themselves as defending Palestinian people in Gaza. But what they're really doing is threatening freedom of navigation and the freedom of commerce. So while for the Iraq and Syria situation, the U.S. has chosen to unilaterally strike back at facilities and personnel, in the Red Sea, the president has asked for a coalition approach. So here there's both a mission led by U.S. Central Command, our military headquarters in the Middle East, through something called Operation Prosperity Guardian to maintain presence and coordinate among a variety of both European and regional partners to show and signal to the Houthis that they will defend freedom of navigation. And then there have also been a series of US, UK, and other members contributing to strikes seeking to degrade Houthi capabilities in Yemen. At this point in time, the Israelis have not been directly involved in the strikes in Yemen, but we see from the news that the Houthis are capable of launching missiles all the way to Eilat. while the Europeans and the U.S. and some Asian partners have worked together to make clear that freedom of navigation is a fundamental principle that will be upheld in the region, what we have not seen is an increase in Arab military participation in these missions. And I would add here one very consistent theme we heard from our trips to regional capitals is the impact on the economy and tourism, not only from the war in Gaza and just the perception that this is an unsafe, unstable region, but very specifically because the Houthis are launching missiles, which has impacted the Suez Canal and the Egyptian economy, as well as international shipping, who now thinks it's better to circumvent the entire African continent than go through the Suez Canal and into the southern Red Sea. So again, a coalition type response for Red Sea security, U.S.-led strikes to respond and defend U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, and then a variety of different forms of support to Israel as it seeks to dismantle the Iran-backed Hamas organization in Gaza without directly involving U.S. forces.
Thank you. Very useful. Thank you very much. Ghaith, I was pretty dismissive of what we heard on the prospects of Palestinian reform on the trip, but your ears are far more sensitive and better attuned to these things than mine. How would you evaluate what we heard, and is it going to be sufficient to really produce a reformed, revitalized Palestinian Authority?
All right, thank you very much, Rob. I actually think that your instinct is right, and I would look at it kind of from three different maybe levels. At a very general level, and I think this is a theme that we saw throughout our trip, is there was a great disconnect between the Israelis and the Arabs and so many things, and this is one of these issues. On the revitalized PA, or what the Israelis now are calling RPA, we've seen a range of views from ain't gonna happen, never gonna happen, to maybe it will happen at some point in the future. But nothing specific, and certainly no real appetite. On the Arab side, it seems to be really a point of consensus in every capital and in every meeting that we had there. So first of all, this disconnect in terms of where the Israelis are and where the Arabs are on this issue. Now, when you go to the Arab positions, and here I have to be very clear, I'm going to be generalizing, but we've heard certainly nuance and difference, not only in different capitals, but even within each capital in the different meetings that we had. But by and large, I would say that what I heard there left me a little bit worried. Yes, they are talking about a revitalized Palestinian Authority, yet they don't see the appetite to do the hard work that is needed to get a real revitalization, real change, reform of the PA. Basically, what I heard are variations on the theme of, we're going to do some cosmetic changes, get this prime minister to replace that prime minister, without really any thinking in terms of how do you empower this kind of prime minister. And remember, the only time that we saw a real reform in the Palestinian Authority is that's during George W. Bush period. It was predicated by a decision to change the political center of power at the very top. Bush said Arafat is irrelevant, and that created the dynamics. Today, I just don't see any of the Arab countries thinking in terms of how do you change the center of power in the Palestinian government, and how do you empower the process of reform. And until that happens, and unless that happens, any kind of reform will simply be cosmetic. Another area of disconnect as well is, we almost hear wishful thinking that the war is going to end and the PA is going to come and take over immediately. This is not going to happen. The amount of reform, just the practicalities of it, are just too much. And I have not heard from within the Arab interlocutors much thinking in terms of how do you bridge between these two areas, and what do you do at the time when Israel will continue to have a security role, yet there will be a need for another address. So, to conclude, I would say, as we think here in Washington, I would say we need to think about four different questions. We need to be pushing the Arabs to, and ourselves, to be honest, to kind of make the idea of what reform and revitalization actually means, to mature it a little bit. I don't think we're there yet. We need, I think, do a lot of work in aligning Israeli and Arab expectations in terms of the role of the PA. Again, not an easy task. I think we need to do some more impressing the Arab in terms of pressing the Arabs to do some to expend some of their political capital in terms of pushing for Palestinian reform, both in, and I'm going to be blunt here, going to President Abbas and basically saying you have to step aside to allow the reform to happen in some form or another. And finally, to really push the Arabs and the Israelis in terms of what kind of transitional arrangements we're going to have between the end of the active conflict and a time when the PA can be capable of actually coming and filling this vacuum.
Okay, thank you very much. Mike, sort of connected to this in some sense. I remember well on our trip, we had one high-level Arab official say, what we really need to move us toward the political goal that we want to achieve, we need a roadmap. Now, of course, we had a roadmap a generation ago, almost. You were intimately involved with that. Could you tell us what that was and how that approach would apply to the current circumstance?
Yeah, the parallels between that time and this time are quite vivid, I would say, actually. I mean, in September of 2000, after a period of, sort of, I would say, optimism in Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, the Second Intifada broke out. It didn't just break out, that sort of uses the passive voice. It was, I think, in retrospect, directed by PLO chairman Yasser Arafat. That kicked off a period of obviously great turbulence and was a tremendous setback for the so-called peace process. But it wasn't until 2002 when the what was known as the Passover massacre happened that things really came to a head, in a sense. And it's important to remember, since we're comparing that era and this era, the Passover massacre involved the tragic deaths of 30 Israelis. October 7th attack last year, you had over 1,200 Israelis who lost their lives. And so the precipitating event was, much more significant in this case. And therefore, I think we have to be realistic. The obstacles to peace are greater than they ever have been. But when we were working on sort of trying to first tamp down the violence and then get sort of peacemaking efforts back on track in the 2000s, we did sort of devise, as you said, Rob, this thing that we called the roadmap. And the basic aim of the roadmap was to think about how do we get from the violence that had consumed the Israelis and Palestinians. And remember, at that time, the IDF embarked on something called Operation Defensive Shield, which involved essentially taking over the entire West Bank and laying siege to Yasser Arafat's compound in Ramallah. And you had, just as you have today, the IDF essentially fully in control of Gaza. You had then the Israel Defense Forces fully in control of the West Bank. And by no means, when the U.S. came forward with diplomatic proposals at that time, did we, encounter a sort of receptive audience on either side. Arafat, we now know in retrospect, famously refused really to play ball at all. And President Bush said he has to go, as Keith just mentioned. But the Israelis were also quite skeptical. Ariel Sharon's conditions for then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's conditions for even considering U.S. proposals was that any Palestinian state, were it to eventually exist, could only really occupy something like 40% of the West Bank and 3/4 at most of Gaza. And so we need to remember these were the sort of initial positions from which American diplomacy had to work. And we recognize that we couldn't simply skip towards the end of the process. Even though many people sort of wished we could simply pick up where we had left off before September 2000, before the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Instead, there was this roadmap put forward, which first envisioned a long period of working on questions like Palestinian governance, the reform of the Palestinian Authority, which, of course, Kate just mentioned is, again, a live issue, the provision of security for both Israelis as well as Palestinians, the building of a viable economy and a viable sort of political order in the West Bank and Gaza, so that any Palestinian state wouldn't fail immediately upon being declared. I would say that occupied 80% of the roadmap that was put forward. And then the second and third of the three phases of the plan involved actually bringing sort of forth the the hoped for Palestinian state. Today, I'd say we face a relatively similar situation, except that, the status quo ante was not one of peacemaking. It was obviously one of, I would say, hopelessness, frankly, when it came to sort of the political efforts between the Israelis and Palestinians. There are some greater obstacles. Settlements obviously have expanded in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, I would say, has been decrepit for quite a long time. But there are also some advantages that we have now that we didn't have then. So, for example, during the 2000s, the Arab states were not significant actors in this process. Today, with the Abraham Accords, with a very different leadership in Saudi Arabia, we have the prospect that the region could be engaged in this process and could bring different assets to the table. And that was one of the focuses of our trip. But the sort of odds are still long, and the sort of task is still daunting. But that shouldn't necessarily be something that dissuades American officials. I think what went wrong in the 2000s, though, is instructive to our efforts today, to American efforts, international efforts today. And that was we were impatient. In 2005, you had elections, probably hastily called elections in the Palestinian Legislative Council. We allowed, and the Israelis and Palestinians allowed Hamas essentially to run in those elections, not explicitly, but Hamas-backed candidates, and they won. And I think after that point, Abu Mazen, President Abbas, was very reluctant to engage in any kind of risk-taking for the sake of peace negotiations with Israel. And the U.S. response essentially was to try to accelerate the process, to say, well, that first 80% that involves Palestinian state building, let's put that aside, or at least let's engage in parallel in the final status negotiations. Let's go to phase 3. Let's go to the end right away. And we're hearing a little bit of that today, except even more urgent. The solution, the so-called solution that's being put forward now is, well, let's recognize Palestinian statehood at the outset of the process. But then what is the question? You end up with having sort of provided a sort of very cosmetic solution without actually filling in the details, without actually having come to arrangements between Israelis and Palestinians that will allow that solution not only to hold, but to be one which is positive for the region. And that, I think, is what we have to avoid today. And so it's counterintuitive, maybe, and it certainly runs against the zeitgeist that we experienced in the region. But I think what's required now is not a new urgency, as it were. What's required now is patience, and a patience which, frankly, we haven't had over the last 20 years. Instead, we have had multiple impatient efforts, which have led to decades of accomplishing nothing.
Okay. Sound advice. Thank you. I now have a bunch of questions that people are sending in to the Q&A bar and also to my email. Raif, I think this one is for you. On our trip, in addition to everything that we've talked about so far, one additional sort of monkey wrench in people's planning is the arrival in 3 weeks or so of Ramadan, which to some people means some things and to other people means other things. Could you sort of take us through this? What is the relevance of Ramadan in the both war fighting and peacemaking process as we approach that? And I think it's March 10th.
It's around March 10th. And look, I mean, I think, frankly, look, in terms of the war fighting, I think we are making too much of Ramadan. Yes, we heard it everywhere. Yet, if you look at the history of Arab-Israeli war fighting, there's been plenty of that during Ramadan. So I don't think in itself war fighting in Ramadan is problematic. It's still problematic on two different levels. On the first level, this is a time where, religious sentiments are much higher and public opinions can be much more easily influenced. This is a time where most Muslims, even who don't go to mosques, tend to go to mosques, etc. So this is in countries like Jordan, Egypt, which are already, and we felt it, I think, in a very palpable way when we were there, feeling a degree of anxiety about their domestic politics. There's a concern that more images like the ones that we've been seeing since October or since the beginning of the Israeli operation would be fodder for whether it is the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's the Iranian-directed media, to inflame opinions, and this is something that we face almost every Ramadan. But I think the real concern, and I think this is a genuine concern that I felt not only we heard in Arab countries, but also we even heard, we talked to some Israeli security folks on this trip, is what happens not in Gaza, but in Jerusalem. Because the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, is basically where Ramadan really matters in terms of access to for Muslim worshippers in the Temple Mount, in terms of tensions between Israel and Jordan over this site during Ramadan. So this is where the real concern is. And in some ways, I am concerned that while we understandably focus on Gaza and on Rafah, because this is where the big story is, this is where the the focus is, yet if we don't focus right now on the issue of what happens on the Temple Mount, this could be the kind of trigger that would start things going south, as it were, in the West Bank. It's been remarkable that the West Bank has been relatively quiet. I mean, there have been daily clashes, yet it has not exploded. There is always concern on when it comes to the Temple Mount and Ramadan. Add to this what we've been hearing in recent days by the Israeli Minister of National Security or Security, Ben-Gvir, about already plans to curtail Muslim access. We might be in for quite an explosive moment there.
Thank you. On a positive note, I think I think it's fair to say one of the most upbeat moments of our trip was a meeting that we had with Mansour Abbas, the Israeli Arab political leader. I mean, not to put any words in his mouth because it was an off-the-record meeting, but there was this very powerful sense that after October 7th, a larger share of Israeli Arabs, at least, understand and even affiliate with the challenge that Israelis are facing. And that was a positive development.
If I may add one more word about Mansour Abbas, one thing that we heard that I can share it because he said it publicly was a very strong theological condemnation of what Hamas did on October 7th. And I think unlike almost any other religious authority in the Arab world that I heard since October 7th. And this is something that I think behooves us in the United States and to the administration to actually engage some of our allies and friends there to get them to actually create and come out with more clear position on October 7th from a policy, political, but also theological point of view.
Let's turn for a moment to some of the questions regarding Saudi diplomacy. Senator Gardner put on the table what the Saudis may have to do to convince Americans. So there are a couple of different issues here that we heard quite a bit about. First, how do Saudis, at least the ones we spoke with, how do they view the concept of normalization? What did we learn from them in general about how they envision the process, what they're willing to do to make it happen, how they envision the outcome? What did we come away with on this?
Well, I think that a lot of this really remains to be seen, because I think what the Saudis seem most focused on are getting their agreements with the United States. Obviously the Saudis are concerned about what's happening in Gaza, but as far as Saudi interests themselves are concerned, their chief threat is from Iran, and they see a U.S.-Saudi defense treaty as important for deterring Iran. They're also very interested, as the Crown Prince has made clear, in civil nuclear cooperation with the United States. Saudi-Israel normalization is, in a sense, the price that Saudi Arabia has to pay to achieve those things. Now, I think that you'll hear Saudis talk about the benefits of normalization with Israel, but I think they do so sotto voce in a sense. It's not as much, as far as I can tell, part of the public conversation, and that may reflect public attitudes towards normalization, which, as our late colleague David Pollack demonstrated in a recent poll, are sort of lukewarm, let's say. There's going to be a sales effort that's required of the Saudis, and I think they're not keen to embark on that until the time is right. I think that obviously the price, as you said, Rob, for normalization, and as Senator Gardner said, has gone up in a sense, because now tacked on to a U.S. defense treaty, a civil nuclear agreement, is something quote unquote irreversible on a Palestinian state. I think that whether that reflects a kind of rethinking of normalization, though, is another question. I didn't get that sense. I think that normalization is still something that the Saudis are willing to do, that they're willing to embark on. I do worry a little bit about normalization getting diluted. Obviously, when we had Israel-UAE normalization, it was essentially a full one-step normalization, not quite, but more or less. I worry that this could be turned into a long, drawn-out sort of stepwise negotiation that mirrors some Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic process, which in my view is not the right way to do it. But we didn't hear too many details on that. I think this is, again, it's something that is highly susceptible to American diplomacy, and that really it's up to the White House, it's up to, as well as our partners in the region, to shape in the days and weeks going forward.
Just one more thought on this, just to build on, you just mentioned the comparison with the Emirati normalization. Many people tend to think of this as the logical extension of what the Emirates and other Arab states have done, but the Saudis actually have a very different idea in mind. I mean, the Emirates, if they had wanted, certain things from the United States, they didn't get much in the end, but they went ahead full steam with their normalization with Israel. Evidently because of what they wanted from the bilateral relationship with the Israelis. From what we heard, it really is much more about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, for which the normalization with Israel is a plus, a benefit, but also a cost for the Saudis. A different approach.
Although I guess one question, Rob, just to tack on very briefly is, was that the UAE's view at the outset, or was this a view they came to as normalization unfolded? My own view is that as Saudi-Israel normalization unfolds, the benefits to the region will be significant. And I think that actually Saudis, as well as Israelis, will come to see it not as sort of a price that had to be paid for some other objective, but actually something which is quite worthwhile in and of itself.
Question for you, Dana. There have been no significant Iran militia attacks on U.S. installations or personnel in the last couple of weeks since the substantial American effort after the killing of 3 American soldiers in the base in Northeast Jordan. Do we count this as success, as deterrence achieved? How would you evaluate this?
Any day that a U.S. soldier is not under attack, threatened, or killed at the hands of Iran and its proxies, I would say is a relatively successful day. But the pause in Iran-backed and supported attacks, I think, has to be seen in a larger context. So first, in addition to the event of the deaths of the 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan, prior to that event, there had also been a process with the Iraqi government to let some political air out of a balloon of the U.S. military presence in Iraq, which is increasingly, and has been for a very long time, very contentious in Iraq. There was an announcement of a political and military dialogue called the Higher Military Commission, the HMC, announced by the Prime Minister of Iraq and the Department of Defense to begin to talk about the transition of the military presence in Iraq. And as part of that, the United States has made consistently clear to Iraqi leaders that U.S. forces are there at the invitation of the government of Iraq to partner with Iraqi security forces and support them to make sure that ISIS cannot return and terrorize the Iraqi people and the Iraqi country. So in that context, what's now been publicly reported is that Iranian militia leaders have visited Iraq and actually told their proxies to calm things down in Iraq and let the politics play out. And this has to also do, I think, with the aspirations of Iraqi leaders who don't want to be an arena for an Iran-U.S. war, but actually want to live their own lives and not have the United States executing self-defense strikes and Iraqi militias backed by Iran receiving increasingly sophisticated weapons. So one, I think the attack on U.S. forces in Jordan is telling. And the pause in attacks against U.S. forces has to be seen on a broader spectrum. But here's the thing. Iran's strategic objective is to expel U.S. forces from the region, and it has not achieved that objective. So at this point in time, I would say it is positive that there's been a pause, but we should expect these attacks to resume, mostly because we know that Iran continues to fund and arm and train these groups. And a good example are the interdictions of really sophisticated weapons that the U.S. Navy has conducted on the high seas. So we know that despite all of this and all of the U.S. strikes, that Iran continues to arm these groups. Now, one other thing to think about here: if there is a successfully negotiated agreement to secure the release of the hostages that Hamas holds in Gaza and some agreement on a temporary pause or ceasefire in Gaza, that does open up possibilities for negotiating on this. When we did have that temporary pause in November of last year, when some Israeli hostages were released, we saw that Lebanese Hezbollah, as well as the groups in Iraq and Syria, pause their attacks for that point in time. So there are many opportunities that open up if that agreement is secured.
Thank you. To Congressman Berman and Senator Gardner, a questioner wants to know: is there any specific item on our trip that changed your attitude toward this set of issues, that opened your eyes to something that you hadn't thought about before, that made you see this conflict in a new or different light than before October 7th? Senator.
Yeah, and thank you, Rob, for that. And look, I think this is the second time I've had the chance to go to Saudi Arabia, and the first time was probably 8 or so years ago. The changes in Saudi Arabia are remarkable from a societal standpoint, and you see the new opportunities, freedoms that society is enjoying, and what that means for the regional influence, the global influence that Saudi Arabia has is quite significant. And so, I think that is eye-opening to see that level of change in society. I also think every time you go and you see how difficult this challenge is, more gets added to the story of how do we solve it, and how can the people come together who desire peace, not conflict, who desire the ability to join together as a community instead of communities of hate. It's challenging, but I think out of all of what we've seen, knowing that we can't go back to pre-October 7th is important. And what that looks like, I guess that's why we're having these conversations. But I do have hope that this will lead to something that can create that peace, that settlement, that opportunity that we've been looking for.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. Howard, Congressman Berman.
Okay. Well, of our three visits, in a way, Saudi Arabia, 3 visits to Arab governments, putting aside our conversation in Ramallah, the Saudis are, in a way, the most interesting of all. For all the different things they did in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then the Crown Prince's attacks on some dissidents. At the present time, at least in our conversations with some of their leadership and watching what the Saudis are doing, and the significant change in the Biden administration's policy towards Saudi Arabia since he was a candidate for president in 2020. That in some ways sounds like a factor that could change things more than much else in the Middle East. I don't know. I have a less a sense of we know that some of the young people that we met in Saudi Arabia, they read the news and they watch what's happening, and their natural feelings are for the Palestinians and the people in Gaza, and critical of Israel. I don't think that is going to. I don't think that's going to make a fundamental difference in how the Crown Prince, uh, how he wants to go forward. But I think the opportunities there are particularly interesting in working things out, both in the context of Israel and generally U.S.-Saudi relationships.
It is interesting to underscore how much of a change, not just the domestic aspects that you spoke about, Senator, but as you mentioned, Howard, Congressman, the shift from the beginning of the Biden administration to where the president is today, in terms of even when you think about it, quite remarkable that the country that Joe Biden was going to consider a pariah 3.5 years ago, we're now going to consider extending the first mutual defense treaty in half a century. It is a remarkable shift, and as part of that, we could have massive Arab and Islamic normalization with Israel. Whether all of this is possible in the time period, the compressed time period, with all the variables that you mentioned, Senator, is a huge question mark. I'm skeptical, but even the possibility is itself quite remarkable. With that, we're reaching the close of this session. There's a lot more that we'll be producing that emerges from our trip on some of the details of everything from Palestinian reform and the future of Gaza to American diplomacy and the potential for recognition of a Palestinian state and everything in between. But for now, I want to thank all of our panelists, Senator Cory Gardner, Congressman Howard Berman, from my far left, Mike Singh, Gaithel Omari, and Dana Stroul. And thank you all very much for joining this special session of the Washington Institute's Policy Forum. Thank you and goodbye.